Okay, so for tonight, there were several immediate political problems that emerged after the Constitution was finished. Most of them have to do with money. This is going to be a new government, so there's a lot of decisions about taxes, how to get enough money for the government to function, what to do about the debts. So a lot of tonight is going to be based in basically the two different kinds of government visions that James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, they come to be two major kind of political theorists also in the 1790s, and Alexander Hamilton. So especially Hamilton and Madison will have very different views of what the U.S. government should look like going into the future, what kind of powers it should have, and what it should be doing economically to make the government more powerful and able to defend itself in a hostile world. The first step, though, was a direct result of the tough ratification battle, the tough political debate about whether or not the individual states should ratify the Constitution. And the major argument against ratifying was the fact that there was no Bill of Rights. There was no statement on the natural rights that citizens held that the government should not ever be allowed to take away without accusing people of committing crimes and throwing them in jail and whatnot. So that's all done legally, theoretically, in a court of law and trial, jury by peers and whatnot. So the very first thing that the government had to do, the new U.S. government, Congress, was to pass a list of rights as amendments to the Constitution, because Madison and other of the Federalists promised that to the American people. If you ratify the Constitution, that's the first thing we're going to do when Congress meets. We're going to immediately alter the Constitution to add that list of rights. So this is seen by historians as the major attempt of the first Congress to justify its own existence, to legitimize the Constitution in the eyes of the American people, at least a vast amount of them who voted against ratification in the first place. So again, Madison was directly involved in the debate on ratification, especially in Virginia. Virginia is one of the most populated and most powerful states. So it was seen as overwhelmingly important for Virginia to go in and accept the Constitution, to go into the new government. So Madison was personally involved in that debate in 1788. And he made the personal promise, as one of the likely government leaders, if this government goes into existence, that his number one goal would be to write up a list of the rights that the government would never be allowed to take away. So this is done for largely political reasons. There are no major legal reasons to do this, to write up a Bill of Rights. That's just not necessary. Number one, because there are no court cases yet challenging this new federal government. So there's no legal necessity, there's no courtroom necessity to draw up these Bill of Rights. There's no legal necessity at all either, because the individual states already had constitutions that already guaranteed the general kind of rights that most people think of as being in the Bill of Rights. Right to owning property without the government being allowed to take it from you. The right to trial by jury, the right to not be tortured if you're arrested, the right to freedom of religion, freedom of the press, all that kind of stuff. The individual states had already promised that to their own citizens. So there isn't a very deep legal basis or a legal need for the Bill of Rights. It was a popular demand. This was something that the people who didn't want the Constitution, who largely feared the Constitution, demanded from the new government. And so many of the first federal government leaders took it upon themselves to immediately change the Constitution to include a Bill of Rights. Madison, from his own writings and his letters to friends and whatnot, we know that Madison wanted to keep these statements on rights as short as possible and as vague as possible. He doesn't want to get into exact definitions of when you have these rights and when you don't. Because if you don't create a close definition, and you leave it open-ended, that means that those rights will cover a lot more ground, right? Does that make sense? If you leave it vague, he knew that future generations would be able to protect themselves from the government by using the vague language in the Bill of Rights. So you often get these Bill of Rights, if you ever read them, they're usually only a couple sentences long, if even that. Many of the first 10 amendments are very, very short because they didn't want to get into those strict, complex definitions. They wanted to leave it pretty open-ended. Madison, his own philosophy was that these Bill of Rights, that what eventually becomes known as the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, he wanted to lay out a general idea of freedom. And he believed that if the federal government starts permitting those freedoms at first, that people will get used to those freedoms. He said that these freedoms will kind of seep into society. And the power will be that people expect to have those freedoms. So that if government ever starts trying to take those freedoms away, that the people would rise up and do something about it. He said that these would not be so much legally powerful right off the bat, but they would be powerful in the long term because this would be something that future generations would be raised with from birth. They would see it as natural to just being a person living in the United States. So you wanted to have very open-ended kind of general guidelines for what the natural rights of the American people should be. And a lot of historians also see this as a kind of natural culmination of the revolution itself. That this is the new, powerful national government stepping in and saying, we are going to guarantee the rights of life, liberty, and a lot of the other kind of ideas in the Declaration of Independence. That this is the natural culmination of everything they had fought for. It is the natural result of a lot of complaint against the British policies from the 1760s and early 70s. The people get the right to own weapons by default. They get the right to refuse having troops stationed in their homes. They get the right to trial by jury. They get the right to not be tortured. They get the right to, if you're arrested, the government has to bring charges against you fairly quickly. They can't just throw you in a hole somewhere and, basically disappear you forever. Theoretically, we know today that that stuff is actually going on. And the people who are doing that stuff should be brought to trial for crimes against the Constitution. But unless the people actually rise up and force that to happen, it's pretty obvious that that's not going to happen. But these are seen as the natural culmination of all the revolutionary theories that had popped up since the 1760s. This is finally written into the government document and becomes the supreme crime in the country to break these laws. Okay, so that's how these come about. They are first debated in the very first Congress. The first Congress meets in very late 1788, early 1789. And this is one of the first debates they take up. What are we going to write? What do each of these amendments look like? It takes a while to actually get them ratified. So they're basically written up and debated in 1789, but they're not passed until 1791. So there's a little bit of a gap because some states hadn't joined the Constitution yet. It's a little bit messy in the beginning, but they know pretty much what they're going to do very early on. So this is literally one of the first jobs they take up as a unified government. To understand a lot of the rest of what they did in the first few years and the major political debate that will dominate the United States right up through the early 1800s, the first couple decades of the 1800s, you have to understand the major personalities that become dominant in American politics. And without doubt, one of them is Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was a hugely famous politician in the first few years of the federal government. He was mostly famous for, just like today, being the writer of the Constitution, or not the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. He is the major theorist and writer of the Declaration. He was voted governor of Virginia during the war. So he was a military governor of Virginia, elected by the people of the revolutionary peoples of Virginia to lead the state. He was also a kind of scientist and researcher himself. He was writing books while governor, and even while the revolution is still theoretically going on, but after the ceasefire had been declared and they're just hashing out the peace treaty, wrote a book about Virginia. He was later appointed American ambassador to France, so he lives in France, in Paris, for a few years as head American diplomat in France. He speaks French. He read about the Enlightenment, so he is very much a kind of American philosopher, American philosopher. So he felt very at home in particularly Paris. He seemed to have loved it. But Jefferson was a rich person from birth. The Jefferson family had been rich for many generations, going back into the 1600s. They were one of the big landowners in Virginia. Jefferson inherited thousands of acres, something like 7,000 acres of land, and a couple hundred slaves when his father died when Thomas Jefferson was 14 years old. So at age 14, he comes into enormous wealth as the direct inheritor. Jefferson is a pretty smart child. He has the best tutors in Virginia. Eventually goes to the best college in Virginia, the College of William and Mary. He gets a law degree. Is admitted to the Virginia bar, which makes him a lawyer in Virginia at age, I think it's 24, and goes into the House of Burgesses, the governing body of Virginia, at age 26. So right out of college, he basically becomes a state-level politician. Why? Because he's a Jefferson. And Jeffersons had been in the House of Burgesses also since the 1600s. So he is born into great wealth and privilege. And he came to believe that the farming lifestyle was the best in the world. He very much understood that he came from wealth. It wasn't a mystery to him. And he advertises the fact that he came from a farming background. He wasn't a farmer himself. He didn't go out and farm the land himself. He didn't put his own hands in the soil and do the actual work. He had slaves doing that. He made money off of their work. But he develops this image of the small-time farmer, the kind of common type of worker. And he says that those common workers, the average farmers, are the most virtuous, most moral, honest, and greatest kind of people in the whole country, if not the whole world. He calls them the yeoman farmer, the small-time farmer who maybe has a couple acres to himself, literally goes into the land every day and raises the food that feeds society and uses that food to feed his family and sell the extra at market for some money and make some profit. He calls this the yeoman farmer. It was a fairly common term back then. So his vision for the United States that he talks about, he writes about, he advertises. He says the United States should be just a collection of these small-time farmers because they are honest, they are good, hard-working people. The salt of the earth kind of people, the commoners. And he calls this theory, and it's been called ever since, the yeoman republic theory. That if you have this society that's mostly built up of these small-time farmers, that society overall will be virtuous and honest and hard-working. And he said that that creates a stable government. That if you bring people out of those circumstances and put them in government, they will run government virtuously and honestly and for stability. And he says that these people are the natural supporters of democracy. These are the people who benefit most from getting the right to vote, because they will choose the people from amongst themselves to go off and run the government. They don't want to sit around and wait for some king to do it, because the king's never worked. The kings sat on their thrones and collected money and enjoyed life. They didn't actually go off and do the physical work that kept society going. So Jefferson points at these guys, the average farmers, and said, look, these are the guys who rose up in revolution against the greatest military power on the planet. And these small-time average farmers actually won the war. So they're the ones who sacrificed. They're the ones who went off and fought and put up with all the pain and misery of the war. And they kept fighting because it was their rights on the line. So he says these people are trustworthy because they're the ones that did it. They were the key to the revolution. So on the other side, Jefferson portrays himself as just one of these kind of small-time farmers. We know he's not. He's one of the rich guys. He's one of the kind of lifetime politicians. But he doesn't want people to think that of him. He doesn't dress very wealthy. He doesn't deck himself out in all these extravagant clothing and stuff. He's rumored to just wear the kind of clothes that an average farmer's kind of wife would make while sitting at the house and having a spinning wheel or something like that, or knitting clothes together. He wore clothes that were kind of ratty. Or at least he was rumored to. Even when he becomes president of the United States. He wears homemade clothes. So he loves this image and he portrays himself like that because he's a politician. I mean, do politicians still do that today? Obviously. You have very wealthy politicians running your government today. They're all millionaires, basically. But they don't want to say it. They don't want to say that, that I made $40 million last year even though I didn't really work. That's not going to get them elected, right? They know that people want to vote for someone else that seems like another common person. So that imagery is still being used today, very obviously. So Jefferson portrays himself as the average farmer. The average farmers often see their enemies in the big bankers. Because farmers have to buy farms by taking on a mortgage. They usually don't have the cash to buy a farm outright. Just like most people today don't have the cash just to go buy a house. They have to take a loan from a bank. And every month they're reminded who runs their lives, right? When they write out that check to pay the mortgage. So just like average homeowners today, average farmers, small-time yeoman farmers back then, hated bankers. Because bankers every once in a while come around and foreclose property and kick families off the land, kick families out of their houses. So Jefferson, like a lot of these farmers, develops a hatred and mistrust of bankers and big-time commerce, big-time commercial companies. These merchants that travel all over the world buying and selling and making a lot of money just by moving goods from one place on the planet to another. Or as he called them, stockbrokers. People that sat in banks or at desks. People who sat at desks in an office somewhere and don't do any physical work themselves. They just move money around from one investment to another. They just move paper. That's all they do. And they're the rich ones in society. And Jefferson said that's a giant problem. Why is it that the people go off and grow the food that feeds society? Why are they poor? And why are these bankers and stockbrokers rich? In Jefferson's mind, that doesn't make any sense. And he said that commerce and high finance and speculation, the kind of investment bubble kinds of people, they're the ones that had destroyed Britain. Those are the ones that corrupted the British government and made it into an empire that set up colonies and dominated peoples throughout the world. He said that system is evil. That is what convinces people to kill each other for money. So Jefferson says this whole system of commerce, finance, banking, debt, people going into debt, and countries going into debt, like Britain did. He says that's the system where the corruption starts to seep in. So his whole idea is to keep the United States based in small-time farmers as much as possible, to avoid debt. Does that make sense? Because he wants to keep the corruption out. He wants the United States to remain a kind of pure place of equality and democracy and virtue. So he has a very stark contrast in his mind between the good people of the world, the good, hard-working, honest people, and then the bankers and the stockbrokers. And Jefferson really throws the question out to the American people. Who do you want running this country? Do you want it to be the common, average type of people, the hard workers, or do you want to pass it off to the bankers to run the government? And he points at Britain and says, that's what happens when you let the bankers and the investors run your government. They'll run it into a hole, it'll be violent, and it'll be miserable for a lot of people. But a lot of historians raise the question. Jefferson portrayed the kind of common farming type of lifestyle in a very idealistic way. Were they always that honest and virtuous? Probably not. But he gives a very rosy view of that whole lifestyle. And a lot of historians ask, he's not from that lifestyle. Almost everything he wants the United States to be, he is not personally. He wants the United States to get rid of slavery. He owns slaves. He wanted the American people and the American government to avoid debt. And he was so far in debt that he has to eventually sell major parts of his own personal library. He hates the big landowners and the big bankers, but he's a big landowner himself. He hates inherited, what we today call dynastic wealth, passed down from one generation to the next. But that's where his wealth came from. So Jefferson, in a lot of ways, is a very confusing historical personality. His whole philosophy seems to be against exactly what he was personally. So a lot of historians say, can he really criticize it as an insider himself? It's an open question. But that's who Jefferson was, and this whole theory becomes known as the yeoman ideology or the yeoman republic. So it's very important to understand going forward. And as a leading politician, he will try to put this theory into effect. He wants the U.S. government to be based on this stuff. So questions about this at all? No. All clear? Yeah.
Wouldn't he just be a perfect example of someone who could criticize it because he knew?
He knew it from the inside, but how well did he know, how good the actual people were? Did he go off and talk to the common person? No, not really. He sat around reading big books and talking to other rich people about philosophy and science and whatnot. So does he have a kind of common understanding enough to know what the average people are like? But he constantly portrays this image, I am just like the common people. And he's very good at it. He's a very good politician in a lot of ways. And he's one of the most popular ones of his lifetime. He writes the Declaration of Independence when he's like 30 years old. So he's a very young guy. And he'll stick around in politics for quite a few decades. Next guy in line is James Madison. He's also from Virginia. Madison was mostly known for, he was a member of the Confederate Congress and he understood how badly that body was functioning. And he quit somewhere around the mid-1780s because he didn't think that body was capable of solving the national problems. And he started advertising and arguing throughout the United States in newspaper articles and whatnot that the articles should be changed to make that government stronger. So he also comes from the Virginia aristocracy. He also comes from a very wealthy landowning family that owned slaves. Like Jefferson, had the best tutors, chose which college he wanted to go to. He went north and went to Princeton University in New Jersey. Got his bachelor degree in 2 years. So, very smart guy. Graduated college from beginning to end in 2 years. And then had a mental breakdown for about a year because of the stress, but very smart guy. Often seen as a political genius, political theory genius. But he also comes from this group of wealthy landowners in Virginia that almost all of them hate bankers. They hate high finance because some of them have been foreclosed on in the past. So they see bankers and debt as a very oppressive force in their life. So Madison will take much of the same kind of political stance and ideological stance as Jefferson. Debt and bankers and stockbrokers are untrustworthy. They are the greedy and the evil in the world. They are the corrupting forces that had destroyed the British government from within And those are the kind of forces that you want to keep out of the U.S. government as much as possible to keep this government kind of pure. Madison also took it to the next level, saying that not only do we, or should we, hate Britain, but we should avoid any deal with Britain going into the future. He doesn't want any diplomatic ties with Britain. He doesn't want any treaties. He wants to reduce economic reliance on Britain as much as possible. And that's an important point because this used to be a British colony. So after the war, Britain is still about 75% of U.S. trade. So trade with Britain is a huge part of the American economy. And that scares Madison. Because Madison and Jefferson really view the British as the most evil in the world. So they want to keep their distance from Britain as much as possible. So you very often get this alliance between Madison and Jefferson because their views are so similar. So that's Madison's background. Hamilton was very much different. Hamilton was born into poverty. So he did know what it was like to be one of the common working people that had an unpredictable future. He was born in the West Indies, basically what we today call the Caribbean islands. He first comes into notice in those islands as a child, around 10, 12 years old or so. He starts working for one of the merchants on one of the islands called St. Croix, which is used to be a French-owned island. St. Croix. He goes to work for one of these merchants for a small-time kind of business on the island that does importing, exporting. And Hamilton is such a good worker that he gets promoted even as a child. And by about the age 13 or 14, the owners actually let him run the business. So he is seen as a financial genius, someone who understands business, how to turn a profit, how to grow a business. They were so impressed with him that several of these merchants, these business owners on that island, pooled some money together to send this kid to college. So he is viewed as a very, very kind of rarely talented child. And he eventually decides to go to New York City to go to a college that was then called King's College after the war was renamed Columbia. Today is Columbia University. So he is a student in New York City when the war breaks out. And he is still a student when the British invade New York. And he literally drops everything and joins the army to defend New York City, thinks this is a good patriotic thing to do, but he's part of the army, part of Washington's army that's kicked out of New York and then across into New Jersey, and then out of New Jersey all the way across the Delaware River. So Hamilton was involved in that and was such a good kind of efficient leader of troops that he was promoted very quickly and became really Washington's personal secretary, what we call the aide-de-camp during the war. So he is kind of Washington's chief of staff, directs all of Washington's correspondence, communicates with people for Washington, sends letters and whatnot, kind of organizer for Washington. So Hamilton and Washington have a close personal connection during the war and even after the war. Washington trusts Hamilton entirely. And Hamilton becomes famous for leading the last attack at Yorktown. So that's where Hamilton's name first comes up in the papers as a national figure. Hamilton came to believe that all the progress that humans made were built up by investment and technology and the growth of business. So he liked being in big cities. He saw those as the centers of culture and refinement and all the great ideas. People like Jefferson tend to view the cities as dens of sin and corruption because that's where the bankers are. Right? Bankers don't usually hang out in the countryside. They sit in the big cities because that's where the money is. That's where all the big businesses are. So Hamilton comes to love the big cities and will become a permanent resident of New York City, more or less, for the rest of his life. He thinks that that's where all the excitement is, that's where all the growth is happening. And that bankers are people who move money around to invest in new businesses, to make money and grow the whole national economy. So he sees bankers in a totally different light than Jefferson and Madison. He thinks that they want to make money for themselves, that's true, but they're also very good and useful people for getting the economy to grow. So he will come to rely on them, just as Jefferson and Madison are trying to keep their distance from them. So a big political fight is going to break out between Hamilton's view and Jefferson and Madison's view. So Hamilton is an economic thinker who thinks about large systems of using debt for investment and industrialization eventually. So questions about Hamilton at all? And there are rumors, even today, that some of the people who wrote the Constitution were so afraid of Hamilton. He's a young guy, he's a very energetic guy, he's a powerful speaker, and a kind of financial genius. Some people that wrote the Constitution were apparently so afraid of Hamilton becoming president of the United States that they put a clause in there saying that only a native-born American citizen can become president. Because where was Hamilton born? Out of the eventual U.S. territory. He is not a native U.S. citizen. So there are some theories saying that they specifically put that in to keep Hamilton out of the White House, or what eventually becomes the White House, out of the presidency. All right, moving forward. Okay. After they do the Bill of Rights, or after they decide what that's basically going to say, the next major conflict for the government is taxation. What kind of tax laws do you want to pass to build up enough money for the government to actually function? For the government to employ people and pay them, and start, building government buildings where the, Congress is going to sit. So they need revenue. And the easiest way to get revenue is to create a tax on imports, these so-called tariffs. So tariff laws are very quickly debated in Congress. In the first national elections in 1788, George Washington is elected president, surprised absolutely nobody, he got a unanimous vote. Every single elector said they wanted Washington for president. A guy named John Adams got the second most, so he became vice president. Madison was a little bit late in filing his paperwork to run for office, so he eventually runs for Congress from Virginia. He runs to be a member of the House of Representatives. So he wins that election. He becomes the first Speaker of the House. So he is in a powerful position to write legislation and get it passed. And Jefferson is living in Paris at the time. Washington appoints Jefferson to be the first Secretary of State, the first head diplomat of the United States, under the Constitution, under the constitutional government. And because Hamilton is seen as the financial genius and has Washington's deep trust, Hamilton is made the first Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, which is basically the head economic position in the U.S. government. So all these guys directly go in to be the first major leaders of the government. So they're in powerful positions, and they will hash out what the different visions of what the United States should be. And remember, this is at a point where a lot of these ideas were really submerged, right, during the Revolution, because everyone was brought together and fighting off the British. They didn't want to argue amongst each other. And then they were brought together and writing the Constitution. So this is the first instance where you start getting different ideologies about what the future of the country should look like. Who should be in control? Who should be in power? What kind of backgrounds those people should have. Thank you. So the first law that comes up is a debate on tariffs. Madison wants what we call protectionist tariff, which means tax U.S. companies that are importing things the lowest. He wants really about a 5% tax on imports in American boats that are flying the American flag. And he wants to create basically another tax level for any formal U.S. allies. Any countries that the United States has signed a treaty with wants to tax them, I think it's 30 cents per ton. So you go from 5 cents for U.S. shippers, U.S. merchants, to 30 cents for any boats from a country the U.S. has a treaty with, and he jacks that up to 50% for any other country. So this is a big tax increase. And who declares war against this tax increase? Who doesn't want it? Any ideas? Who argues against this? Who is most likely?
Hamilton?
Hamilton doesn't like it, obviously, because that's mostly going to hurt the British. And Hamilton says the British are 75% of our trade, so we don't want to make them mad, because if they retaliate, they can really sink us. But also a lot of just the general merchants in the big cities. They say if you jack up the tax rates on imports, we're not going to get as many imports, so the U.S. economy is going to start shrinking. We may have to lay off workers. So Madison's plan is killed. And they create a much more general tax thing where you do the one rate for U.S. shipping and then just another rate for all other countries in the world. So Madison's idea is killed in Congress. And the eventual tariff they pass is much more general. But this shows right off the bat there's some political infighting. The next major question, now that they have enough money to actually run the government on a day-to-day basis, is how do you pay off the debts from the Revolution? Many states still had debts from the war. The Continental Congress had debts from the war, and it was agreed in the Constitution that the new federal government would take on all the old Confederacy's debts. So now there is also a national debt that has to be paid off. So in the debates over what to do economically to deal with the debt, Hamilton's voice really rises to the forefront because he's seen as the kind of lead economics expert. His plan has several layers. He says, number one, the federal government, the national government, that will eventually be housed at Washington, D.C. That city hasn't been built yet, so the first government sit in New York City. His plan is for the national government to take on all of the state debts and just add them into the whole national debt. So some states had paid off all their revolutionary debts, all their debts from the war. So the national government's only going to take in the debt from the states that still had something to pay. Not all the states have to pay. So there's a big argument amongst the states who had paid, saying, well, that's unfair. We paid off all our debts. How come they get off? How come they get off the hook? So again, there's some political infighting. Why does Hamilton want the national government to take on the state debts? Who is worried about this the most? Who has something to lose in this? The people who owed money, who loaned money to the governments, to the state governments. They're worried that if the states declare bankruptcy, they'll never get their money back. So Hamilton realizes that it's mostly rich people lending money, right? So he wants to get the rich people of the country to have their allegiance to the national government, not to the states. He wants to solidify and empower the national government. And he knows the best way to get someone's allegiance is to make yourself, the federal government, the center of the payments to pay off the debt. Does that make sense? If you have loaned the government money, if say you loaned the state of California money, and the state of California is on the edge of bankruptcy, if they declare bankruptcy, you're not going to get your money back. If Washington, D.C. steps in and says, okay, we are going to pay it back, you don't care about the state of California anymore, right? Because your money is going to be coming from Washington. Does that make sense? So Hamilton knows that in the minds of the wealthy, the most powerful people in the country, if he does this, they will be much more interested in seeing the survival of the federal government than the survival of the states. So he's using this to bring together support for the national government, which he thinks is a great idea. He wants to use government revenue to, in his words, develop the national economy, which basically means he wants to use government revenue to loan to businesses to either get started or to grow their business, to hire more workers to do more trade, or to make more stuff. And who is directly opposed to this? People like Jefferson and Madison. They look at this and say, what the hell is Hamilton doing? He is giving money to people who are already rich. He's giving money to the bankers and the stockbrokers and the investors. To Jefferson's mind, this is one of the most evil things you can possibly do. You're making the rich richer. You're taking government revenue from taxes from the people and giving it to the wealthy. So Jefferson and Madison just absolutely are livid at some of these ideas. Hamilton wants to go further and create a national bank of the United States to be a kind of central storehouse for all the money that the government takes in, and also to make those loans to businesses, to build them up, make them bigger and stronger. Because Hamilton's idea is you have to have large businesses, you have to have a growing economy to compete in the international market. The United States is so weak and small at this point economically that they have to grow as fast as possible in order to compete and defend themselves against Britain and France and the other dominant powers of the world. So Hamilton has a very long-sighted view of what American power needs to be, and he wants to use economics to get there. And he actually wants a pro-British foreign policy, because in his argument, Britain is 75% of U.S. trade, which is a huge chunk of the U.S. economy. So he says we have to be friendly with them, at least. We can't attack them, because if they choose, they can destroy us economically. So he says we have to be friendly with Britain. We may not like it, but we have to, just for our economic survival. And again, the Jeffersons and Madisons of the country all start rising up and saying, what are you doing? You're making deals with the devil. You're making deals with the most corrupt government, the most kind of imperialistic government, the most greedy government in the world. And they start looking at Hamilton saying, well, we won a revolution against the British, and now we're giving in to their demands? Hamilton may be selling us out. And that becomes a very consistent argument, an accusation against Hamilton, is that he's really just in love with the King of Britain for some reason. He wants the United States to be just like Britain. That's why he's making all these deals. So there's a lot of kind of deep and angry political attacks against Hamilton because of these ideas. But let's see. No, there's one more. Also take government revenue and give it directly to people building factories, called the manufacturers. And this is where the Industrial Revolution is starting to rise in Britain. And Hamilton says we have to do that too in the United States. That is going to be a source of world power eventually. So we can't fall too far behind. And the British are already doing it. The British are already using government revenue to prop up British businesses and build more factories in Britain itself. So Hamilton says if the U.S. doesn't keep up and doing the same thing, we're going to fall so far behind that they might just have so many guns and whatnot eventually, they might just invade us again. Who knows? So Hamilton's kind of system of thought is very controversial, especially for people who believe in Jefferson's Yeoman Republic idea. And remember, Hamilton is the Treasury Secretary. He gives reports to Congress, he testifies, he has Washington's ear, so he is one of Washington's biggest advisors. But Jefferson is also there as Secretary of State. So the cabinet meetings in the Washington administration between the Secretary of War, the Treasury, the Secretary of State, the President, the Vice President, these and the Attorney General, these became very contentious shouting matches sometimes between Hamilton and Jefferson, because they have just diametrically opposed views of the world and the U.S. place in it, what the United States should be. Jefferson hates all this stuff. And Hamilton says this is what we have to do to make the United States independent in reality. Make it a world powerful that is strong enough to stand on its own. So questions about any of this stuff? No. Okay. Paying off the debt is extremely tricky because the state governments had printed a lot of paper money. A lot of that money was fairly worthless, especially in the middle of the war when it looked like these states might not win. The states were so desperate, they had so little money that they paid their own soldiers, the militia, the guys that are actually out in the field with the guns fighting the British Army, paid those soldiers in that paper money instead of giving them gold or anything like that. They just printed a bunch of paper, drew some fancy designs on it, called it money, and gave it to the soldiers as payment. Soldiers didn't like that very much. So a lot of these bonds that had financed a lot of this money, the soldiers are also getting paid in. And anytime the state during the war went off and bought more guns or more food or whatever for its soldiers, they also paid in either these bonds or these state printed monies. The problem is that these bonds and these monies had devaluated to extraordinarily low levels during the war because it looked like the states might not actually win. So if you're a soldier out there fighting and you're paid $100 a month to go off and fight, and you get paid in one of these bonds or one of these pieces of paper money, that says on its face, on the paper itself, worth $100. During the war, you could probably only buy about $10 worth of actual goods with it. They had devalued that much. So a lot of soldiers, immediately when they got paid, when they got this paper money, they wanted to get rid of it as fast as possible because the value of that money is plummeting. So they go to investment types of people who have a lot of gold or goods or something that a lot of these soldiers and whatnot need. And these guys end up being basically big bankers, speculators. They have the gold, they have the resources to get a hold of that paper money. And what they're doing is literally going to the soldiers and other people who had these bonds and paper monies, and they say, okay, that thing says $100 on it. You cannot buy $100 worth of goods with that. We both know that. So I'll give you $50 in gold for it. Or $20 or $10 in gold for it. And because the people who were getting paid in that money distrust it so much, they say, okay, I might as well get $10 worth of stuff now than maybe next week I'll only get $5. Does that make sense? So the bankers and the investors had hoarded this paper money. They had bought it all up. They are taking the risk because they say, well, wait a minute, what happens if the states actually do win the war and eventually the state is going to pay me back the full face value of that money? That means I have given some guy $10 of gold to get this piece of paper that says $100. So I invest 10. If the states win the war and the United States becomes independent, I can get back 100. Does that make sense? And that's a risk. That's why it's called speculation. And that's why these guys are called speculators. These are stockbrokers and bankers that see a good investment opportunity. It's risky, but you can spend so little money to buy it that you can get a high reward eventually in the end if everything turns out your way. So that by about the year 1790, when it's being debated in Congress, are we actually going to pay off this national debt? Who's going to pay it? The soldiers don't own the paper anymore. It's long gone out of their hands. These are sitting in bank vaults now and in the homes of rich people who have hoarded all this stuff. Does that make sense? So when the deal eventually will go through that the government will pay back the face value of this money, of the paper money, who's making money off of it? The rich, the bankers. Who's getting screwed in this?
The soldiers.
The soldiers. The people actually went out and fought. And this is Madison's beef. Madison hates speculators. He hates bankers. He's one of these Jefferson-type people. Madison looks at the proposed law, Hamilton's proposed system of the federal government taking on all the state debts and then paying back the full value to whoever has the paper money in their possession. Madison says, this is a horrible plan. This is really sticking it to the soldiers who were the source of American independence. These were the good, hard-working people who actually went out and fought against all odds and actually won the war. How dare you go off and give all this money to the bankers who didn't do a damn thing during the war? They sat behind their desk and looked for investments. So Madison and his followers in Congress are livid. Madison comes up with an alternative plan. First, they vote down Hamilton's proposal, and then they come up with their own plan. And Madison's plan is to pay off the current holders only the market value. So if they had bought that piece of paper for $10 in gold, pay them their $10 so the investors aren't losing any money. And Madison says, try to track down the original holders, the original soldiers who were paid in the money, and give them the rest. And Madison said, that's fair. What's the problem with that system?
Tracking down soldiers?
Yeah, tracking down who the original soldiers that owned all this paper was. This is almost 20 years ago by this point. This is 15 years ago. And a lot of these guys didn't get receipts for this transaction. So how are you going to figure out where, who the original owner of the cash was? So Hamilton makes that argument. This would be good in a perfect world, but we don't live in a perfect world. We have to deal with practical reality. So Hamilton's followers in Congress vote down the Madison proposal. So there's a stalemate. Who's going to make money off of this? And the business class obviously don't like Madison's proposal because they are the investors. They're the ones that, they don't just want to break even. They want to make money. They want their investment to come in and make themselves rich. So their proponents, the kind of business class proponents in Congress, vote down Madison's idea. Because they're in it for profit. And you have a gigantic stalemate. All this is happening March, April of 1790. And there are compromises proposed in Congress just like today, and one by one, one faction or the other, one group, the Hamilton group or the Madison group, vote it down. So nothing much is happening. It's a big controversy that's not being resolved. Again, Hamilton wants to assume all of the state debts, wants the federal government to assume all the state debts. He wants to do that to get the entire business class to support the national government because that's going to be the source of their eventual payments and their profit. And his genius is to build up an economic system that if you're going to become wealthy in the United States, you have to travel through his system. For the most part. So he is a kind of theorist of government power reliant on economic relations. And he saw that connection very clearly. So the so-called Assumption Bill, the federal assumption of state debts, that bill deadlocks in Congress because speculation is rampant. And the Madison people know it, and that's their accusation. So Hamilton desperately wants to get this assumption of all the state debts. He wants to get this going. He says that this will stabilize the economy and even allow for great economic growth. And Hamilton eventually proposes a compromise in June and July of 1790 with the Jefferson and Madison types of thinkers. And this leads into the next controversy. The national capital city had not been chosen yet. People like Hamilton want to locate that city, that national capital, in a city that's already large. And Hamilton's preference was New York City, because that was basically the financial center of the country already. Others wanted to locate it in Philadelphia, where the Constitution was written. Jefferson and Madison do not want it in a big city because they say that's going to be too close to the bankers and the stockbrokers. They're going to have too much influence over government. So Jefferson and Madison want to move the capital further south, really as far south as possible, to get away from the big cities and all the kind of corruption of money and greed. So a compromise is proposed where the national capital city will be located not in Virginia, but really between Virginia and Maryland. And so the Madison and Jefferson kind of faction will get what they want on the national capital if they give in and allow the federal government to assume the state debts. And Hamilton gets what he wants on one side, Madison gets what he wants on the other, so it's a compromise. And this is known as the assumption for capital deal. And that's why they eventually build Washington, D.C. where it is, which was really nothing but a swamp back then. And the joke with, at least the joke that's come out since, is that Washington, D.C. traded malaria for politics and got the worst of the deal. That's why the national capital is centered where it is, directly as a result of a political compromise between the two rising political parties. And they are political parties. So skipping forward about a year and a half, from about the summer of 1790 going into the summer of 1791, Hamilton, piece by piece, convinces Congress to enact what is called, historically, Hamilton's grand design, his large financial package, his big ideas. First, he got the assumption of all the state debts. Next, he got the creation of the Bank of the United States. So that is created by Congress. And very quickly, the United States starts creating a national debt to take on investment and promise to pay that money out within a few years with interest. So the U.S. Pays off its debts from the Revolution, which, just like today, if you pay off all your debts, your credit worthiness goes through the roof, right? Your credit score goes up way high. And the U.S. national credit score really went up very high because they were paying off their debts. They were taking on much longer-term debts, which seemed pretty manageable. So the United States government is a pretty good place for foreign investment, for foreigners to give the U.S. government money with a guaranteed return with interest going into the future. And the U.S. economy booms. It launches into one of the biggest economic growth rates in all of American history. And people largely gave Hamilton credit for this. Remember, when the Constitution is created, the United States economy is chaotic, to say the best. It was in bad trouble. And once Hamilton got in and pushed Congress to do all this stuff, the economy grew, it stabilized at its core around the national government, the federal government. And historically, this has become known as Hamilton's financial miracle. And Hamilton really reaped the rewards politically of this. Hamilton becomes one of the most famous and respected politicians and loved politicians of his time. And in the late summer of 1791, the British are even sending an ambassador to New York City at this point, where the capital city, because Washington, D.C. hasn't been built yet. The rumors are in the United States negotiate a financial and economic treaty with the U.S. government. So Hamilton, piece by piece, within about a year or so, puts through his whole program through Congress. And this really very much irked the Madison and Jefferson type people, and they fought against it. They just didn't have the votes to stop it. So this convinces Madison and Jefferson to start consolidating their group and start forming a political party to try to oppose what Hamilton is accomplishing. And of course, when they start coalescing into a party, Hamilton starts getting his followers together and forming them into a major political party. And Hamilton's last piece, his last big vision, is to, again, create a national debt, use U.S. government revenue to support the growth of U.S. businesses, especially businesses that build factories. And toward the end of 1791, they're going into the next presidential election year, 1792. The first 4 years are over. So the next major national elections are happening, and that's where you really start to see the kind of strong beginnings of the rise of these two parties, the Hamilton faction and the Madison and Jefferson faction. So questions about any of this one? All right, moving on again. Hamilton delivers a major report to Congress to convince them to vote to use government revenue to support U.S. businesses. This is a big research project for Hamilton, and he finishes it and testifies before Congress and delivers what he calls the Report on Manufacturers. And a direct quote from it shows you exactly what he wants to do. He wants government to help manufacturing businesses, businesses that will build factories, industrial businesses. And he wants the government to do this step by step in pre-planned ways. So it's systematic. What does this mean? He says that the Europeans are already doing this, especially the British. The British are spending British government money and giving it, investing it in British-based companies, privately owned companies, in order to give them more money to build factories faster. Hamilton says the British are doing it. If we don't keep up, then the British will outbuild us eventually and become far more powerful than the United States. So Hamilton says this is also a kind of national security problem in today's terminology. This is needed for national defense against foreign enemies. So he says we have to create a national debt, what he calls a funded debt, which means take investors' money that they're willing to loan to the U.S. government. So you're taking on new debt. It will be the responsibility of Congress, the federal government, to pay off that debt. But he says you can pay off that debt over a certain amount of years. You know, you write up a contract. Person signs on for 6 months, a year, 5 years, 10 years, as long as 50 years. And of course, the longer you take on the loan terms for, the more interest you're going to get, so it's a larger profit. So he says, borrow money, and according to the terms of the contract, you'll pay that money back with interest over time, and you're going to pay that money back by using the yearly tax revenue from tariffs or fees or licenses or whatever the U.S. government is making money off of. But he says this would be a great thing as long as it's used wisely. Take on some foreign investment so you get an influx of cash very quickly. You can use that cash to invest in businesses or invest in building roads or whatever the government wants to do. And that will build up the U.S. economy, will make the economy grow faster. So that's more competitive with Europe. And he says that the economy will grow so quickly, you'll get so many more jobs, so much more trade, that your tax revenues will grow up. And therefore, if you get more money in yearly taxes, you can pay off the debt with interest and still have money left over. So he says, again, this is a fostering of government. It's an encouragement to growth. It's a shot in the arm to government, or to the national economy. And he usually wants to direct this at industry. The report is also very interesting because he calls this in the report the mixed economy. He does not, and he says this explicitly, very clearly in the report, he does not want the whole U.S. economy to be based in banking or industry or factories. He says he wants that to be about half the U.S. economy, and the other half is agriculture, the small-time farmers that Jefferson loved. So Hamilton is not an extremist. He's saying we have to do this a lot, but we are not going to forget our roots in agriculture. He says that's hugely important also. We have to still grow the food. We have to have those farmers. So he calls this the mixed economy. Jefferson and Madison didn't want any of this. They just want the whole thing to be farming. So Jefferson and Madison are very afraid of this kind of system because it's a system of debt. It's a system of investment. And those are the exact same kind of things that they saw as the corrupting forces in Britain and really the source of evil in the world. Evil and greed, maliciousness, people's willingness to hurt each other for profit. So Hamilton is arguing to do exactly what people like Jefferson and Madison fear and hate deeply, right down to their core. So does all this make sense? And Hamilton directly gets involved in this stuff. Hamilton starts his own group to foster investment in New York City. Starts raising money and giving it out to small businesses, the manufacturers around New York. And this is where Madison and Jefferson start arguing that they have to create a political party to resist this. Their view is that the United States is sliding toward corruption very quickly and will basically just be another Britain if this continues. And that all the freedoms and all the gains and all the good things about the revolution are being sold out. So Madison argues very clearly that political parties are now inevitable. And if they are inevitable, that he explicitly says that there are two parties. Now one must balance the other. So just from that kind of language, you assume that there's going to be two parties. Madison and Jefferson defined themselves and their followers as the Republican Party, or the Democratic Party. They call themselves the Republican Democrats or the Democratic Republicans or something like that. So that's where those labels first come from. So they call themselves that. They say that the average American worker is a small-time farmer, and the average American worker supports the Jefferson and Madison view, the Yeoman Republic idea. So Madison argues that most people in society are natural Republicans because of their economic background and status. Most people are not the big bankers and investors. Most people don't like that stuff. So Madison says, in any free and fair election, the Republican Party, as it starts to grow, will dominate the election if the average people are allowed to vote. And he labels the other side as the anti-Republicans. So like the anti-freedom, right? The anti-patriots. And he says that they are evil. They don't have enough popular support to win elections, so they have to gain favor from the rich to build up enough money to run good real clean campaigns with big advertising stuff to win elections. It says their power is based in money, greed, corruption. So of course when they win elections they want to go sign treaties with the British and do all this stuff with debt. And they try to grow the powers of the federal government by taking over powers from the Constitution that are not clearly spelled out in the Constitution. They want the federal government to do more than these guys, the Madison guys, think that is written in the Constitution. So you get the rise of these two parties, these two factions. Now Washington hated in about 1792, even when Washington is running for re-election. So does that make sense? And this is all clearly spelled out in an article that Madison wrote called Parties, literally, that appears in newspapers throughout the country. So Madison's ideas are interesting in that how much they change from the 1780s to the early 1790s when he actively starts helping to build this Republican Democrat Party. So from Federalist number 10, when he was arguing to adopt the Constitution, he said that the biggest threat to Republican government is the creation of a dominant and tyrannous majority that overwhelms the minority. And in Federalist number 10, he says that the political interests of any one region or city or group are mostly defined by their economics. and that a large republic will allow many different kinds of economies to come together, and therefore the different political interests of different political groups will balance each other. But that all changes in his article called Parties in 1792, where he says the anti-republicans are the minority, the bankers and the stockbrokers, and they are the threat against the majority. So you see the exact opposite from his ideas from 5 years before. In 87, he was worried about the dominant majority. In 92, he's worried about the dominant minority. Does that make sense? So he's changing his mind in a lot of ways. And he says that there are now two parties, so not a whole lot of different interests amongst the many regions and cities. There are two parties that are defined by political ideas, not by economic status. And that those two parties will always fight each other. Does that make sense? And this is all being built up. Largely, the conflict is being built by Hamilton's success. He got virtually everything he wanted passed through Congress in the first few years. And his opponents start feeling like they have to come together to resist. And they start building the first major party. And then Hamilton very quickly responds by gathering his followers together and building up what became known as the Federalist Party. And again, the differences are really both parties start talking to the people. Who do you want to run your government? Do you want government to be run by the so-called small-time common farmers, the yeomen? Or do you want government run by the wealthy and powerful? By the bankers and the stockbrokers and the investors and the big merchants, the big businessmen? You know, what do you want the future of the country to be? All right, so the Republican ideology, the Republican-Democrat ideology. I mean, those two words are literally used together. Usually for short, they're called the Republicans. That's what Madison referred to them as. The Republican ideology is pretty reminiscent of the yeoman idea that Jefferson advertised. Jefferson is also one of the founders of this party, but it really leaves Madison to do the mass organizing. So Republican ideology, hatred of speculation, hatred of the investors and the bankers, and real deep mistrust of their eventual motives. I mean, what do bankers and stockbrokers want to do? What's their goal? To make money. That's what they're there for. That's what they work for. They work for profit. They're not working for national unity or anything like that, in Madison's mind. So the hatred of investment, speculation, the hatred of government debt, and what he called the broad interpretation of the Constitution. The broad interpretation means to assume that the Constitution is giving the government powers that are not explicitly, clearly written out word by word in the Constitution. And he has a pretty good argument, because in the Constitution it literally says that the federal government only has the powers that are given to it in the Constitution. So Hamilton has a good argument for that. Or Madison has a good argument for wanting to keep things pretty restricted and focused on what is exactly written in the Constitution. But there is a passage in the Constitution toward the end of Article 1 that says that Congress shall have the powers to enforce any of the necessary things that Congress is told to do in other parts of the Constitution. And Hamilton seizes on that and says, well, we're supposed to be running the national economy. Congress is supposed to run the creation of money, so that implies that Congress should also have the ability to create a national bank. Does that make sense? Nothing about national bank is written into the Constitution for a long time, until the early 1900s. Or, no, not ever, I don't think so. No. Yeah, not ever. So Hamilton makes that inference, and Madison and his followers hate it. The whole Jefferson yeoman ideology that the farmers are the great people, the common people of the world, who had risen up against the king and created American independence, and they should be the people that are trusted to be in power. That whole ideology goes in and becomes a major piece of the Republican Party ideology. The hatred of Britain, in particular, as the prime example of corruption and greed, imperialism, and inequality. Britain is ruling over peoples throughout the world, which creates inequality. You cannot have equality when you have a ruling class and a ruled class, right? Things are naturally unequal at that point. So Madison holds the Republican Party up as the egalitarian party, the equality party. The party that supports democracy in the real world, because democracy is supposedly supposed to be based on equality. And as these two parties form and consolidate power, as they go forward into the next elections, the Federalists largely win most elections of the 1790s. So they're in power, and the Republicans become a complaining party, a minority party that looks to block legislation and whatnot. And Hamilton and Madison are basically the leaders of these two parties, and they're at each other's throats for the rest of their lives. So these two very close friends and co-workers in the 1780s are going to work together to convince the population to have a convention to amend the Articles of Confederation, to write the Constitution, to get the Constitution ratified. They worked very closely together. In the 1790s, they are split apart because they have two very different visions for the future of the country. And they never forget it. They're constantly at each other's throats, and that feeling of animosity never goes away. And this becomes personal. They start attacking each other in newspapers on the personal level. They even start attacking each other's wives. It gets really, really ugly. So when you hear these politicians saying, our politics used to be so civilized back then. No, that's absolutely wrong. It got ugly very, very fast.